John, this story is coming out of the Miami Herald, creating quite an uproar in the development community and real estate community in South Florida. Miami Herald story, I'll read you the headline, first couple graphs, and then I want you to comment on it. Headline: a new law is supposed to boost affordable housing. South Florida cities are furious. First couple graphs: the Florida legislature was widely praised this year when it passed sweeping legislation designed to supercharge construction of affordable housing by directing hundreds of millions of dollars in low-interest loans and big tax breaks to developers. But in the early days of implementation in South Florida, the Live Local Act, which is called, is running the significant roadblocks because of another less publicized feature of the law that went into effect July 1st. Provisions that override local zoning controls on building height and density. The idea is to allow developers to build big in exchange for setting aside apartments and mixed residential and commercial projects at lower rents for people who meet certain income criteria. The new law, touted as bold and comprehensive attempt to tackle Florida's crippling housing crisis, requires cities and counties to approve the projects without hearings where elected officials could seek public input and discuss and vote on the proposals, even if they dramatically violate existing height and density restrictions. Last graph, Mr. Gruss, then I'll ask you to comment. Critics question whether the state law really will help people struggling the most to afford soaring apartment rents and home sale prices that became South Florida's hallmark during the pandemic. Most controversially, the Live Local Act bars local authorities from enacting rent controls as Orange County voters did last year. Housing advocates had called for such controls to calm down the frantic Miami-Dade housing market. Mr. Gruss, basically what the law has said, you want affordable housing, we'll give it to you, but developers, if they give you affordable housing, they can reach for the stars in terms of the height, and nobody cares what the local planning and zoning board members think in each of these communities, whether it's Hollywood, it's Doral, or it's anywhere around the coast. What say you, Mr. Gruss? Is this good? Is it bad?
Well, you may remember in the last season of the podcast, we talked about this.
We did.
And the thing that sparked all of this was that some municipalities like Orlando and St. Pete, by the way, were sort of going off the reservation and starting to enact rent controls. And the legislators, the Republican legislators up in Tallahassee went ballistic over that. They were like, no, that's not going to happen, because it was starting to spread. It started in Orlando, it spread to St. Pete. And then all these other communities were talking about imposing rent control. And the legislators freaked out and said, no way, this is not happening in Florida. So they got together and enacted this legislation. And that was certainly part of the legislation. But then what they did is they promised a buttload of money for affordable housing in exchange for doing away with rent controls, and gave developers basically carte blanche to develop, as much as they wanted, as long as they had this, certain amount set aside for affordable housing. So, I mean, one of the big problems to creating affordable housing is you've got a lot of NIMBYs in Florida, not in my backyard, people who don't want affordable housing. They may complain about that there's no affordable housing, but they don't want it in their backyard. So this basically circumvents the whole NIMBY crowd, and bypasses the zoning boards where things get bogged down, and the whole neighborhood gets up in arms, and basically projects don't happen. These affordable housing projects will never happen because of local opposition. So to bypass that, the legislature said, then we're just going to take it out of the municipality's hands. And so, you can't have affordable housing without allowing density. It's just as simple as that. And in urban areas where there's access to public transportation. And unfortunately, a lot of neighborhoods are going to be, their character is going to be altered. And I think you're already starting to see some of that happening. And, there's nothing municipalities can do. I mean, they can lobby their legislators to change the statute, but developers now have a green light, basically. And if you try to stop them, if municipalities try to stop them, they're going to get sued. And, they're going to lose. So it's actually, it's interesting. The story says that everybody's been caught by surprise, but this was like extensively discussed last year.
Yes, it
I mean,
was.
there was quite a bit of reporting. There was a lot of back and forth. All these issues were out on the table, and now we're reading that people are shocked and surprised that this is happening. And I'm like, where were you? Like when all of this was going down, it's kind of surprising a little bit. And yeah, I think these issues have been like, they were well hashed out in the press and everywhere else. And I'm a little bit surprised that, people are now coming and saying, well, we didn't realize this was going to happen, but
Donna,
it's happening.
Donna, let me ask you this question. You pride yourself on spending a lot of time in downtown. You walk, you take public transportation. You've seen a lot of changes. This sort of reminds me of what happened in a so-called Edgewater neighborhood of greater downtown Miami. We had a bunch of 2-story houses or multifamily, 2 units, 1 unit on the top floor, another unit on the first floor. Developers came in, they bought these houses for a shit ton, and that is a real estate term. They bought them for a shit ton. They assembled all these blocks and they put up 40 and 50-story towers. And today, still, you'll see a couple little 2-story buildings next to a 50-story tower. Donna, do you think that what we've experienced in Edgewater over the course of the last 15 years or so, and I would define Edgewater as basically the MacArthur Causeway all the way up to the Julia Tuttle, it'd be somewhere in the ballpark of 14th Street up to about 36th on the east side of Biscayne Boulevard. Do you think that's really what state of Florida is looking at now based on the new legislation, where these little 2-story single-family home communities or multifamily home communities with a lot of character, like John mentioned, can basically just be steamrolled, and we're going to have a whole series of 30 and 40 and 50-story buildings?
I think it's going to keep happening. He made a really good point about the give and take of that. So like with the green light for the developers, I mean, they're gonna want to, developers want to go high, and that is going to completely transform communities, but it's also going to be able to allow the more affordable housing projects that you absolutely have to have, because it is so completely not affordable and in a lot of South Florida right now, especially Miami. So it's give and take, and I think you're going to see it keep happening for sure. I mean, Wynwood's already. It's are you considering Wynwood to be like just outside of Edgewater, or?
Yeah, it would just be outside of, it's just to the west of it, generally speaking. So Mr. Fakler, you got here in the 80s.
Yeah.
Let's say you're long in the tooth, but you've been here a while. You've seen a lot of stuff. How do you think this applies to South Beach, where you have all these 2-story buildings? Now, many are in historic, designated areas, but we all know how much we pay attention to history. At least the governmental leaders do pay attention to history down in South Florida. Mr. Fakler, could you see someplace like South Beach being totally changed, even though the city of Miami Beach is pro quality of life and anti high density, anti new construction?
Well, I don't know so much about South Beach. It still has that international flavor that's probably going to, visitors and tourists, and it's going to keep the pricing somewhat high.
But if you could bring 40% of a project earmarked for affordable housing, wouldn't that be an advantage?
Well, listen, affordable housing is the redheaded stepchild of South Florida real estate. Let's get past that. I got to tell you, in New York, the only way you could afford to live in Manhattan is to rent control. And I lived in a rent control apartment myself. That I subleased it. But that's, there was a certain amount of, give and take as far as that goes in New York. It's once again, not something, real estate developers wanted to talk about. There was a lot of legislation changing some of those rules. That might happen down here as well. But I just don't think affordable housing it's a non-starter here in South Florida. And I don't care if it's South Beach or anywhere else in the area, in my opinion.